Furious because she had received a traffic ticket, Karen marched to the police station demanding to speak to the person responsible. She started shouting, demanding respect, banging on the table, and, at the height of her outburst, she ended up slapping an officer in the face. The silence that followed was brutal. All eyes were on her, and before she could process the size of her blunder, she was being handcuffed and taken straight to her cell. There are many places where you can complain about a fine. You can swear on Twitter, yell at customer service on the phone, or even mumble to yourself in the car while you slam your hands on the steering wheel as if you're going to solve something. What shouldn't you do? Go to the police station with blood in your eyes, yell at everyone and freak out so much that you leave in handcuffs. But of course, that's exactly what this woman did. The town was small, so any movement that was different attracted attention. When someone makes a scene, everyone knows about it the same day. And when someone makes a scene at the police station, my friend, that's a subject that goes on for weeks. And that's what happened. The reason? A traffic ticket. $150. Yes, all because she didn't want to pay $150. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning to understand how a simple fine turned into a spectacle of public humiliation. That morning, everything seemed normal. People were going to work, the sun was shining, and no one suspected that the city was about to witness one of the most memorable outbreaks of the year, until her car appeared. The woman parked so violently in front of the police station that she almost ripped the "no stopping" sign off the curb. She got out of the car, slammed the door, slung her bag over her shoulder, and marched towards the entrance like a bull going for the kill. Inside, the police station was running as usual. A policeman writing reports, another drinking coffee, an attendant on duty checking documents. Everything went smoothly, until the door opened wide and she walked in, huffing. The clerk didn't even have time to ask her what she wanted before she threw a crumpled piece of paper on the counter, crossed her arms and declared, with that tone of someone who thinks she owns the world, "This is a mistake, and I demand that it be cancelled." The policeman took the paper and calmly unfolded it. A fine. For speeding. Registered by a speed camera. With a photo and everything. Now, any rational person would look at the evidence and think, okay, I screwed up, I'll pay. But no, this woman decided she couldn't accept reality. The attendant sniffed and replied professionally, "Madam, this is a speed camera violation. The license plate is yours, the speed limit was 60 kilometers per hour, and you were clocked at..." He paused, adjusted his glasses and looked again. "You were clocked at 103 kilometers per hour. In other words, almost twice the speed limit." The woman snorted, rolled her eyes, and spoke with all the confidence in the world. "That's impossible." The attendant just raised an eyebrow and pointed at the photo. "It's your car, right?" She looked at the picture, and her expression quickly changed to something between irritation and despair. Because yes, it was her car. You could even see the driver's shadow in the picture. But instead of accepting the blame, she doubled down. "This radar must be wrong. You must have calibrated it wrong. Or someone doctored that photo." Patience in the room began to evaporate into thin air. One of the policemen drinking coffee in the background laughed discreetly and muttered to his colleague, "Here we go again." Because yes, she had done it before. This woman had tried to argue against fines before. She had complained about parking, ranted because the policeman was in a bad mood and wanted to pick on me, and once even threatened to sue the city because the street striping was confusing. But this time, she wasn't going to win the fight. The attendant, still calm, took a deep breath and explained, "Ma'am, if you believe there was a mistake, you can legally appeal, but this fine was applied correctly. The system is automatic and reviewed regularly, but she didn't want to appeal legally. She wanted someone to press a magic button and erase the fine on the spot, as if the police station were the customer service department of a shopping mall. And when she realized that she wasn't going to get what she wanted by being polite, she started to change her strategy. "This is an abuse of power," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "I pay the taxes in this town. You work for me." The volume of her voice grew louder. Some people in the police station began to pay attention. The policeman who had been laughing before now became serious. The attendant was no longer smiling, but if she had stopped there, she would still have had a chance of leaving with some dignity. But people like her never stop at the right time. And that's when she made the fatal mistake. The woman raised her hand and hit the police officer next to her on the shoulder, without realizing that she had just crossed the barrier between annoying complaint and assault on a law enforcement officer. The impact was light, but it was enough. The policeman turned slowly. He looked at her. He looked at the attendant. He looked at the other officers who had stopped what they were doing. The silence that followed was brutal. Her face lost color instantly, because the very second her hand touched the policeman, she knew she had screwed up. She blinked a few times, as if her brain was trying to find a way out of the disaster it had created. But before she could say anything, the policeman turned completely towards her and reached for the handcuffs on his belt. And that's how, in front of all the witnesses at the police station, the woman who went in to cancel a fine ended up being arrested red-handed for assaulting a police officer. The police station was one of those old buildings with faded beige walls and uncomfortable hard plastic chairs. But that day, the woman wasn't worried about the decor. She had a mission: to make the police pay for the humiliation she had suffered. She walked in as if she owned the place, her heels clacking against the linoleum floor. She approached the counter, slapped the ticket down, and crossed her arms. "This is a grotesque mistake." The policeman at the counter, a tired guy who had clearly seen all kinds of nonsense, picked up the ticket and read it without haste. "Madam, you have been fined for parking in a prohibited place." She snorted, her eyes blazing with indignation. "I only stopped for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to get a coffee. Since when is getting a coffee a crime?" The policeman sighed, rubbing his eyes as if he knew it was going to be a long day. "Ma'am, it doesn't matter if it was 5 minutes or 5 hours. It was a loading and unloading area." She opened her mouth to retort, but he continued, "You have a photo of your car. You have a record of the infraction. You have witnesses. You want to appeal. You can do it on the website." But the woman didn't want to appeal. She wanted to win. "This is an abuse of power," she shouted, attracting the attention of the other officers and the few people in the police station. "I bet you only fined me because I'm a woman." The policeman remained impassive. "Madam, this has nothing to do with your gender. It has to do with the fact that you parked in a prohibited place." But it was impossible to argue with someone who is never wrong. She began to raise her voice, to complain about everything, about how decadent the city was, about how unfair the laws were, about how she paid taxes and had rights, until, in the middle of one of her speeches about how policemen should serve the people and not act like dictators, she hit the counter table hard. And at that moment, everything changed. The action was so sudden that the policeman's papers went flying. The radio fell off the table, and most importantly, the policeman's coffee cup tipped over on top of him. The silence was instantaneous. All eyes were on her now. The policeman looked down at his uniform drenched in hot coffee, took a deep breath, and stood up slowly. She realized what a fuck-up she had made. "I didn't mean to." She tried to make amends, her voice a little less arrogant. The cup was in the way. The policeman stared at her for a few seconds. Then, with the calm of someone who has already decided someone's fate, he said, "Ma'am, come with me." The woman's eyes widened. "What?" He signaled to another policeman, who came immediately. "You have just assaulted an officer on duty." She froze. "Assault? It was just a cup of coffee." "Ah, so now actions have consequences? Interesting." The policeman took a pair of handcuffs from his waist. She started to take steps backwards. "You can't do this to me." The policeman just smiled. "Yes, I can. I will." The sound of the handcuffs clicking echoed through the police station as everyone present watched in sheer delight. And so it was that she, who had gone there to try to intimidate the police, ended up being taken to the police cell. And best of all, the fine was still valid. If one day someone had told me that the most insufferable woman in the neighborhood would end up in jail for throwing hot coffee at the police, I would have laughed. But there she was, handcuffed, being taken to the police cell as if she were a real criminal. And the funniest thing? She made it happen herself. But of course, Karen, because, let's be honest, that was her spiritual name, wasn't going to accept defeat without a fight. As soon as she entered the cell, she started screaming, "This is an abuse of authority. I know my rights. I demand to speak to the chief of police." The irony? She met the chief of police at the worst possible moment. When he entered the police station, already aware of the chaos that was taking place, the sheriff, a man in his 50s with a belly like someone who eats too many donuts and a look like someone who has no patience for bullshit, stopped in front of the cell and crossed his arms. So, he looked at her file. "You came here to complain about a fine, threw coffee at a policeman, and now you want to leave as if nothing had happened?" She lifted her chin, trying to regain her dignity. "It was an accident. I just hit the table." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's funny, because there's a recording showing the moment you almost knock over the entire counter." She blinked. "Recording?" "Yes. We have cameras. Lots of cameras." The color drained from her face, because now there was no excuse. "This is unfair," she insisted, not as loud as before. "I shouldn't be here." The sheriff shrugged. "But you are. And you're going to stay here until we pay your bail." The word bail made the woman pale even more. "Bail?" "Yes, because assaulting an officer is a real crime. And you know what's most interesting?" He smiled a little. "Bail costs more than the fine you came to complain about." I wanted to be at the police station at that moment just to see the exact moment when she realized how big a mistake she'd made. But the best was yet to come. She still thought she could get away with it. After a few hours, the woman managed to call her husband. "Honey, they've arrested me," was the first thing she shouted down the phone. I imagined that the reaction of the man on the other end of the line was something between, "What?" and "What did you do this time?" But the most interesting thing? She didn't tell the truth. "I was arrested for a fine," she screamed, trying to look like the victim of the situation. The policeman sitting at the counter, listening to everything, just rolled his eyes. Her husband must have said something about picking her up, because she calmed down a bit and prepared to leave as if she was about to be released with honors. The problem? Her husband didn't know about the bit about the coffee thrown at the policeman, and when she arrived at the police station, she went straight to the sheriff. "I'm here to pay my wife's fine," he said, opening his wallet. The sheriff just shook his head. "It's not just a fine, it's bail." The man frowned. "Bail? What do you mean, bail?" That's when the sheriff explained everything. The woman, who had been so confident, just stood there, watching her plan fall apart. "You threw coffee at a policeman?" her husband exclaimed, looking at her as if he couldn't believe it. And it was, at that moment, my friends, that something spectacular happened. The husband simply let out a deep sigh, put his wallet back in his pocket, and walked out of the police station without posting bail. That's right, he left his wife in jail. And what happened next? Well, that's for the last part. If there was a more humiliating way to end that day for his wife, I couldn't imagine it. She was in jail, waiting to be bailed out, like a wronged queen. And then, in front of everyone, her own husband turned around and left without posting bail. The silence in the police station was so brutal that you could hear the wall clocks ticking. The woman froze. "What? What are you doing?" she screamed, clutching the bars as if she were in a dramatic movie. Her husband didn't even look back. "You got yourself into this alone. Get yourself out." And he walked out the door like someone who had just dumped a bag of garbage he didn't want to carry anymore. The police? They had to make a superhuman effort not to burst out laughing. The woman stood there, alone in her cell, processing her abandonment live. For years, she had managed to get away with everything. The complaints at the HOA, the fights with neighbors, the messes at the market. the attitude of superiority everywhere she went. But now even her husband didn't want to bear the consequences of her idiocy. And for the first time in her life, she had no way out. The humiliation only got worse when she realized she had no one else to call. She tried to call her sister, but got a voicemail. She tried a friend from the HOA, but got a dry, "Good luck with that." She tried a lawyer, but the guy just said, "We can talk when your bail is posted." In other words, she was all alone. The hours passed. At first, she tried to keep it together. She sat on the cell bench with a closed expression, as if she were above the situation. But over time, reality began to hit. The cell was cold, the mattress was thin, and the smell of strong disinfectant only made the experience worse. And worst of all, she knew that everyone in town already knew. Because, let's be honest, a Karen being arrested for stupidity, that kind of news spreads faster than gossip in a condominium group. She only managed to get out the next day when she was forced to pay her own bail with the card she had hidden in her handbag. And the humiliation didn't end there. As she left the police station, hoping to regain some dignity, she realized that her husband had taken the car away. In other words, now, in addition to spending the night in jail, she would have to return home by cab. But the town was small. All the cab drivers already knew the story. When one of them stopped to pick her up, she couldn't hold back a smile. "Hey, lady, did you sleep well?" Her face immediately turned red. And the icing on the cake? The next morning, the sheriff sent the original fine to her house by post. In other words, in addition to the bail, she still had to pay what she had come to claim. Now, you're probably wondering, has she learned her lesson? Well, after that day, the woman disappeared from public life. She stopped showing up at HOA meetings. She stopped yelling at her neighbors. She stopped meddling where she wasn't wanted. But there is one detail. From time to time, I still saw her in the market, walking quickly through the aisles, her head down. And every time she passed near the area where they sold coffee, she changed direction. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think. Until the next video.